Hey, and welcome to my very first Patreon tutorial. I'm really glad that you stopped by. I hope you enjoy this one. So for this very first tutorial, we're going to take a look at something pretty simple. It's just a hairy interaction with some RBD colliders. Just to give a quick overview of what this will look like, we're going to start off and we're going to create the hair that we're going to use in the Vellum simulation. And also we're going to create an RBD collider for all those little tubes that are floating around. Post the Vellum simulation, we're going to up-res our hair so that we can simulate a lot less hairs than we eventually render with. And then finally, we're going to create a little web map solver that will allow us to add some color with a decay as much as we want to help with the render times. So let's dive into a new scene and check it out. So here we are in a fresh new scene. The first thing I'm going to do is hit D over my viewport and change the background to dark. I just prefer working in the dark. Now we can create a geometry container and we're going to create this and label this working. I like to work in one container and then I like to render in separate containers. So this will be our working. And because we're in Houdini, we want to keep things as procedural as possible. And so for that, I'm going to use a circle and I'm going to sweep this rather than using a torus. Let's make this a little bit bigger and let's just max out the segments so we have something that looks a little bit like this. The next thing I want to do is transform it. And this is totally up to you. I just know that for Instagram, I'm going to be using a slightly taller aspect ratio. And so to fill out the frame a little bit, it's nice to get something that's a little bit longer than rather just pure round. The next thing I want to do is I want to create an ends node. And this is going to be for our RBD simulation. We want a nice curve that we can use our pop curve force with. So we're going to do this and we can just give it a null and say out curve. And just to keep things organized, I like to just label things and change their colors. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a sweep. We set it to round tube and we're going to make it quite fat, something like 0.05. This looks pretty good. And now we can do a subdivide. And let's go with maybe 2. So it's really nice and smooth and subdivided. The next thing I want to do is I want to break up my shape so that it's not so uniform. I find that this gives a much more pleasing result. And we can just use an attribute noise for this. I'm going to change it from CD to P so that it affects the P. But I don't want it to be just positive. I want it to be 0 centered. So this now pushes the points out from where they are. This is obviously way too much. So we can turn this down to something like 0.5. And the noise, we can maybe make it a little bit bigger. Something like this looks great. The next thing I want to do is I just want to smooth it out just so that I don't have any of these jagged, ragged corners. And let's maybe try a different noise, maybe Perlin Flow. I like to use this one. Yeah, this looks great. So you can see that it's now no longer just a shape that's smooth, but it's got all these little concave and irregular edges, and when you apply hair to it, it just starts to look a lot more organic and a lot nicer. We can now use a hair gen, and this hair generator is just going to add hair to our geometry, which is great. It's basically like copying lines to our geometry using a scatter. So this density is how many points we'll have, and we're going to go something really low res 600, because post simulation we can add more hair and that saves a lot of time in simulation. So let's go with this, and if we scroll down, the only other thing I want to change is I want to change this length, and I'm going to make it something nice and long, something like 0.7. Other than that, I'm going to leave this at default. The next thing we want to do is we want to use a group expression because we want to get the first point of each of these hairs. And so I'm going to change it to points. And let's grab the first point of each primitive. Now I've got the root point and we can label this as root. And get root. And then let's create a Vellum hair. In the Vellum hair, the first thing I want to change is I want to change the thickness to something like 0.5. And it's a bit tricky to see, but if we zoom in and we visualize this, you can see that 0.5 makes the hairs roughly around the same thickness that they are now, which is what I want for this simulation. Now, if we scroll down, we can pin our root group, and we're going to just keep it at permanent. And the only other things I want to change is I want to just change some of these damping settings so that it's a lot more damp, so it doesn't try and resolve as much, so that they kind of stick to where they are. And again, we'll make it just a little bit less bendy. That's all I'm going to change for my Vellum hair settings. And now we can drop down a Vellum solver. We're not going to do too much in this Vellum solver. We're just going to add 4 substeps and remove gravity. And let's just move this over because we're going to add in a collider. So now this is our Vellum solver. And if we hit play, nothing will happen. And as you can see, nothing's happening because we have no colliders and we have no forces, which is totally fine because we're going to add in some forces. So let's do that. What we want to do is we want to take it from this subdivide, or actually from our smooth. We're going to just create a null, and we can just say out RBD, or out for RBD. And let's just make this yellow or black, doesn't really matter. This is just so that I know I can see very easily when I'm moving around what these nodes do. The first thing I want to do is I want to add a peak. And the reason I'm going to do this is because I don't want these shapes. I'm going to copy some shapes onto some points, and I don't want them to be right where these hairs are being generated. I want them to be outside so that as they get sucked in, they affect the hairs. If they're on the hair ready, as they move it, because they're colliders, they'll pull the hair and they'll stretch. So let's peak this out to somewhere where it's just outside of this hair line. So maybe something like 0.9. That looks good. Now, because of this ugly geometry, if you look inside this geometry, let's get rid of that. You can see that I have all these penetrating shapes. And we're going to use a scatter in a second, but the scatter will actually scatter points inside this shape. Where I don't want points and I don't want objects. And so to fix that, the Labs tool has this really cool new node called Remesh to Grid. And it basically just does a VDB calculation, which is really nice. Make it a little bit more high res. So I get something like this, and now there's nothing inside. So when I scatter, I just get points on the outside, which is perfect. To rearrange my nodes, I'm just selecting them and holding A and then sliding down just to kind of keep them all neat. So before we add scatter, let's just add some normals. This will be carried over onto our scattered points, which we'll want. And then I'm going to use a MOPS randomize. I'm going to randomize the orientation, and I'm also going to randomize scale. Once we've copied our object onto here, we can fine tune the scale. So let's do that. Let's grab a tube. And let's just decrease the height to something like 0.5 and increase the columns to 50. And we can give it some end caps. What we want to do now is just do a bevel, just to give it some nice rounded edges. We don't want to do all the, if you don't have this, you can see it bevels all these edges, which we don't want. Now it just does the top one. We can do something like 0.05. And let's just round it out a little bit. That's good. And then let's do a UV unwrap. This is just going to give us some nice UVs in case we add textures or something subtle. This in Houdini 19 added this UV in the viewport, which is really handy. Now if we use a copy to points, I have all these points. Now, this is way too many points. So let's grab the scatter and change this down to something like 50. This looks good. And in our uniform scale, I want to randomize uniform scale, not scale. I can change this to maybe 0.2 and I don't know, 0.4, just so that they have some nice points. And if I check my hair, I see make sure that none of them are intersecting at all. This looks pretty good. And if they do, I can just run this peak and I can maybe just make it slightly bigger to be super safe. So that looks good so far. And these are going to become our RBD. And so I'm going to check this pack an instance, which is going to convert them into packed geos. And I can use this in the RBD simulation. RBD solver. The other thing I want with this RBD solver is I want the collision so that these don't go right through the shape. And so I'm going to grab another peak, and this is going to go into this collision input. But this one, I don't want it to be so big because otherwise it won't interact with the hairs at all. But this can be something a lot smaller, maybe 1/5, just so that it hits and rolls around nicely inside this shape. So if we highlight this, you can see the blue is the collider. But something that you need to check with your colliders is always check in Visualize, check what your collider actually looks like. And you can see that this is what it sees my collider as, which I don't want. I want it to keep its actual shape. So I can change this to concave, and instead of create animated static objects, just create static objects, because my incoming shape is not going to move at all. So this looks good. A few other settings that we want to change. I want to decrease friction a little bit on these objects so that they don't get stuck in any of these gaps, but they can move around. And I'm going to do the same in this friction here. I also want to remove gravity so that they don't fall down. All right, so if I hit play now, you'll see nothing happens because I have no forces. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to copy this out curve. And if I dive inside here and I add a pop curve force, this allows me to bring in a curve to manipulate my objects. So I can paste this in now. And something I like doing is just doing it this way, so that in case I change any of the names, this will still work. Now I just need to make sure that this is big enough that it picks up all these objects and none of them are outside, which this looks like it's doing perfectly fine. I'm also going to decheck treat as wind. I'm going to increase this to 4 and 4. Now if I hit play, you can see how incredibly fast this is, and this is one of the reasons that I enjoy using this. Now they're all shooting out, which is not what I want. So let's reduce the orbit scale and just see if this works a little better. Okay, they're still flying off. This isn't working. So what we can do is add a pop speed limit. This is great to eliminate some of that speed, which should keep them sucked in. There we go. Now, because there's not enough velocity on them because of this pop speed limit, they just travel around inside here. And I can maybe make this slightly smaller and maybe add a little bit of orbit speed so that they actually orbit around the shape and you get a bit more movement. So that looks great. So now what I can do is I can unpack these so that they turn back into normal geometry, and I can drop down a file cache. And we can cache these out. And once these are cached out, I'm going to drop this into the Vellum solver. So let me quickly render this out. Great, so now these are loaded from disk and I have my simulation. Something that's not great with this at the moment is that they're all clumping on one side. All right, so if I add a pop wind, that seems to add a nice bit of movement that gets it to move around and not stick just to the outside edges, which I prefer. So I'm going to stick with that and run another file cache. All right, so now I have a really cool organic movement of these going around, and I can now run this through Vellum, my Vellum simulation. Okay, so that finally finished rendering. That took quite a while, but now we have this really cool hairy thing with our objects in the background. And I admit that it is quite hard to see what is going on with hair in Houdini. You can change this in here to show open curves, and I don't know, to me this doesn't really help much. So I just go with what I see here, and sometimes I'll even start rendering now just to get a preview of it, what this will look like in Redshift. But for now, yeah, this looks pretty good. I can see that there's some movement, and if I visualize these, I can see that these are deforming the hairs quite nicely. So the next thing we want to do is we want to now add a lot more hair and then manipulate these hairs with some other hair nodes, or the grooming nodes. So the first thing we need to do is we need to grab our base surface, which is the smooth, and I'm going to drop down a hair generate, and we can plug the guides into the second one and our surface into the first. And just like this, now we can actually add in more hairs. And I think for mine, I use 6,000. Again, you can hardly see what's actually happening here, which makes it hard to direct this. But for now, we can add 6,000, and when we start rendering, we can make some adjustments and changes as we would need. Next thing we want to do is we want to change this to p-scale, as Redshift will read the p-scale value of these hairs and not a width attribute. I'm then going to use a hair clump node, and let's plug in that. And this is going to now just clump these hairs into little bits. Obviously, this is not what I want. This is way too extreme. So let's just dial some of these settings in. And these are the settings that I used. But again, it often helps to play with these settings once you start rendering so that you can see a lot more effectively what these are actually doing. So we'll change this to a value of 1.2. Let's reduce this tightness so you can see the tightness is how closely bundled up they are. So we'll reduce this down and also the stray amount down. Stray rate, stray amount. I also like to use this fractal clumping. I find that this gives some cool results. And as soon as you increase this, you can see that these other ones are activated, and we can just play around with this. For now, I'm going to keep that as is. And now we can also use a set length. And this just lets you change the length of this. So at the moment, it's setting the length all to a value of 0.1. I'm going to multiply this by incoming value, and I'm going to randomize this and use values of something like 0.8 and 1.2, just so we get some random lengths here. So you can see before and after, this is all straight. And now adding just this little bit of randomness just breaks it up a little bit and gives it some nice look. The last thing I want to do is add some frizz. This effect on its own is quite strong, and so I'm going to just reduce it down to something really low, like 0.01. And you can see if you look at these hairs before and after, it just adds a little bit of kink to each hair, which is really useful and makes it look really good. Now we have that, we can add a null here, and this is just going to be our out colliders. And whenever I know that I'm going to send this to render, I just add one of these, and I'm going to do the same thing on this side, which is going to be the surface, because I'm going to render the surface as well. And the reason that I need this right now is I'm going to create a SOP solver, and we're going to create that wet map that I told you about. So the hairs are going to go in the first input, and this collider is going to go in the second input, or we can just grab it from the file cache. I'm going to drop down here, I'm going to drop down a color node, and I'm going to do a ramp from attribute, and I'm going to label this wet, and let's just grab maybe something like this. I just don't like black, so I'll remove black. And we don't have a wet attribute now, but we're going to create one, and it's a lot easier to visualize once you have this color node in here. So the things that we're going to need is we're going to need input 1 and input 2 and the previous frame. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to attribute copy our position in. Because if you have a look now, there's no animation, because this is looking at the previous frame, and the previous frame has no animation. And so we're going to attribute copy in P. And now if we jump out, the SOP solver only works once you jump out of the solver itself. You'll see now it's thinking a little bit because we have a lot of hairs. So this is running a little bit too slowly. So while we set it up, let's just use our original Vellum hairs, which is a lot lighter, which helps us just preview a lot faster. And you can see now it's bringing in the animation, which is what I want. So that's what the attribute copy is doing. The other thing I want to attribute copy in is p-scale, so that we have an accurate p-scale coming from this hair gen, which at the moment we don't have, but it will once we plug that in. The next thing I want to do is on this input 2, which is the colliders coming in input 2, we want to create an attribute. And so we can just do an attribute create. Let's say create wet. It's going to be called wet, and this is going to be a value of 1. And now we're going to do a little bit of vex. Okay. So what we want to do now is we want to look up this wet attribute that's coming in on input 2 on the points on our hairs, and we want to transfer this attribute onto these points. Now we could do it with an attribute transfer, which is basically what we're doing. Because if we transfer the wet attribute, and turn this down a little bit, we can see that as these get a little bit closer, I think my transfer distance is too much still. Yeah, there we go. So now you can see that it is working. If I hit play, now this is working. So we are transferring it, but at the moment, there's no fall off. It will just keep adding to the previous frame, which is not what we want. We want to add a nice gradual fall off, which is why we're doing a little bit more complicated, but in Vex. So if you want just a simple way, you can just do an attribute transfer inside here. The first thing we want to do is we actually want to look up the closest point, or the wet attribute coming in input 2, and look at its closest point on our hairs. And we're going to use a function called PC cloud for that, or PC open, sorry. And if we have a look at this, I'll open up the help card. We need a geometry, which is going to be input 1. Then we need the position attribute, and then the vector P. And now we need a radius, as well as the max number of points that we want to search for. So the radius is how far away we want to search for that wet attribute, and now how many points do we want to search for that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to bring in that wet attribute based on this PC open or this point cloud. So we're going to use a PC filter for that. And this is going to use our PC cloud that we just created. And we're going to look up the wet attribute on all those points. So now we have looked up all the wet attribute that's coming from our colliders, and we've stored it in this wet attribute. And now we want to apply that. So we're going to say if at wet, which is going to be the attribute that we're creating. We're going to take wet, which is what we just created, plus wet previous. And what we want to do now is we want to create the previous wet attribute, which we don't have yet, because we don't have a wet attribute. And so we're going to create wet previous, which is just going to equal if at wet. So now we're bringing in the wet attribute from the second input, as well as we're adding it to our current. And finally, we don't want this to go over 1. And so we can just clamp it to if at wet, 0 and 1. And now if we jump out and we hit play, we should get something that looks exactly like the attribute transfer that we just had, except that we need to create our attributes, radius of 0.1 and maybe a max point of 10. There we go. So now we get something very similar to the attribute transfer, but again, you'll see that there's no decay, there's no fall off. And the simple way that we can add a decay is just to multiply our incoming value by a slightly smaller amount. So we can say wet previous times equals, and let's create a decay slider. Okay, and so this value we're going to make something like 0.9, for example. And now when we hit play, you'll see that the value comes on, but then it fades away quite quickly in this case, too, which is perfect. So we're going to open this and it's a parameter interface. Let's uncheck forbid linking. So now when we dive in, we can grab these and just drag and drop them into our parameter interface. Say accept. And now we can adjust them here. And you can see if we have a decay of 1, it's the same as if we weren't doing anything, and it sticks the value the whole time. If we have a very low value, it will decay straight away, basically. And just where the colliders are, you'll see a color. So this is a really nice controllable way that we can have very long trails, or we can have really short trails, depending on what we want. We can also change how thick they are. So you can see that we can make them really beefy and fat because of the radius, and we can change the number of points to make it a little bit faster. So now we can plug the high-res hair into this, and you can see that this is working as well. This is quite slow now because there are a lot of points that it has to iterate over, but we can just drop down a file cache and let it tick over and we're ready to go. So the file cache for the wet maps has finished, and I can run a quick flipbook to have a look and see what this looks like. So here we have our flipbook. You can see we have this really cool movement of the objects running through and the wet maps leaving this really cool trail behind. So in the next part, we'll take a look at some lighting and materials and how to set up our scene and all that fun, good stuff. So stick around.